Fuels from Sprague. And so, Kevin, I'll turn it over to you for your presentation and for a bigger introduction about who you are and what you do. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, hey, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Kristen Schweitzer here at Sprague has told me a little bit about your organization, and she's educated me about some of the different things that the organization does. Really happy to be here today and appreciate you guys reaching out and asking me to join. Just by way of introduction, I am the Director of Renewable Fuels. I've been with Sprague now for 25 years. My background is originally in oil trading, but about 15 years ago, the company asked me to look into something that was called biodiesel and asked me to look at getting more involved with renewable fuels. And really that has become the focus of my career over the past 15 years. While I do some government affairs work for Sprague, the majority of my time is supporting the sales staff and really is spent behind computer screens trading renewable fuels. So it's not often I get to do PowerPoint presentations, a fact that will become very apparent very quickly here today. I have been asked to give a quick overview about renewable fuels as well as focus on a few things in the market. I will say I've packed in a lot of data into a short period of time, and my goal is to take up all the time so we don't have any time for questions. No, really, if any questions, I'd rather have this be a discussion. Please feel free to either raise your hand or just unmute and shout out. You're certainly not going to offend me by jumping in. But I'm just going to go, like I said, go through the slides quickly, and please feel free to jump in with any questions. So there are four main drivers in the renewable fuels market currently. And if you get nothing else from this presentation, this is the number one. It's regulatory is by far the most important aspect of any renewable fuels market, and it drives the entire sector. Without regulatory and federal and state policies, there is no renewable fuels market as we currently see it today. So nothing else, just this is the area to pay attention to whenever you're talking about renewable fuels is what are the regulations and what are the parameters driving the rules around this market. On a federal level, we have things like the RFS policy, as well as the Inflation Reduction Act, which I'm sure everyone's familiar with. And I should have prefaced my presentation by saying, obviously, everyone's in the energy industry, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time with kind of the base introduction of things as, this great presenting to folks in our industry because they already have the knowledge of what we're talking about here. The second part of regulatory is on a state level, and this is probably the areas that everyone sees this. States in the Northeast where we operate have become very aggressive in creating policy to drive carbon reduction targets. Now, a lot of those policies are just being formed now, but it's already causing a lot of issues within our industry. So federal and state are the two main drivers of it. The other drivers are consumer demand. I'm sure everyone has seen within their individual markets, more and more consumers asking for fuels that reduce the carbon footprints of the activities that they're in. Three, I would say, is then investment in the sector. We've seen a lot of money pouring into this sector, which I have a couple slides on. And finally, price. As we all know, working in a commodity business, that if you are not competitive on price, then the odds of success for growing your business are going to be very limited. So we've seen a tremendous amount of decrease in the price of these fuels. But a lot of that price decrease has been driven by the number one driver of renewables market is on the regulations, either through carbon tax or incentives for these renewables. So next slide, this is my sarcastic slide of the presentation. Not much happening politically. Truthfully, it's a state of flux for renewables because we do have a new administration coming in, and it's really unclear what the Trump administration is going to do. And I think trying to guess on that is extremely challenging for anyone. The first Trump administration was not especially kind to renewables, but they've grown a lot since then, and there's a lot more interest especially in red states, on some of the aspects of not only the Inflation Reduction Act, but growing renewables in general. I give you an example. Texas is the largest wind producer now in the country by far. So I do think there's going to be more support for renewables in this Trump administration. But yeah, like I cautioned, really hard to make a prediction on what's going to happen over the next, 90 days to 4 years. Change in biofuel tax credits. As anyone who's in the biodiesel industry probably knows, there's a massive change going on in tax credit. I can get more into that or answer any questions on it, but that's just something that we need to know because the current credit expires at the end of the year. On a state level, we've seen states come out with a lot of different announcements about increasing regulations and about different aspects of renewable fuels they want to grow. Those are really in flux, though, and there's not a lot of clarity in the Northeast states on what's going to happen. But finally, we see some large entrants into the renewables. I cite folks like Chevron and PBF and Valero, who have massive renewable diesel production facilities now, as being a good example of that. So next slide, to talking a little bit about growth in renewables. I think the slides will do certainly a lot better job than I can explaining it. We highlighted some of the important things about renewables, and one of them is investment. So if you just go back and look at this this chart's from 2004 from Bloomberg, but really I just look at 2010, where we saw 213 billion was invested in renewables on a global basis back then. That number's up to 1.8 trillion last year. Just staggering sums, and you can see where that has been focused on. In 2010, there was nothing in electrified transport, and now that makes up nearly half the investment. And we've seen growth for not only in the transportation sector, but on the power grid side for renewables. So that type of an investment into the sector shows you where the dollars believe that the growth is going to occur within the energy markets. Next slide. So we continue to see a increase in investment, but what does that translate to on the generation side? Well, I like this slide from Canary Media here, because it demonstrates where we've seen this massive influx. Now, this is for power generation, but on the solar side, right? Solar, again, going back to 2010, just a tiny component of it. But in 2025, 15 years later, it makes up half of all the new clean energy. Now, this isn't all the generation. This is just the new clean energy which has come on board. Again, you're talking about massive amounts of wind, solar, and distributed solar making up this. So next slide here. Why has solar grown so much? Solar has grown for two main reasons. The most important, the drop in cost, right? Solar panels, as we all know, if we think back to back in the 90s and 2000, that solar was a lot more of a expensive boutique item. But now solar panels are being made, some through subsidies and some just through the technology getting a lot better. You see the cost has dropped exponentially on a per watt basis. And because of that, on the left-hand side, you'll see what the growth has looked like. Now, solar, the growth percentages are a little skewed because it came from such a small place. But this type of growth certainly gets your attention. Sprague, we have our own small but growing solar group, where we focus on a very specific aspects of solar. But it just shows for a company that traditionally came from back in the 50s and 60s, oil and coal. I think we have a good example, old picture over on my shoulder here. Now we're focusing on the new areas of growth within our energy markets. So if we go to the next slide, that's on a global basis. You can see what was being built out and where the investments were. But if we come back, what's happening on the United States side? Well, it's a pretty similar picture, right? You see natural gas obviously is still the primary generator of power here in the United States. But if we go back, this is on a 6-year basis. Wind over that period has more than doubled its production. And solar under the same period has gone from 1% to over 5%. So, over 400% increase. Most of that has come at the expense of coal, while nuclear stayed steady. So we can see that type of investment and that type of decline in price starting to work its way into the U.S. market, albeit on a little bit less basis in comparison to other parts of the world, but still pretty significant changes over just a 6-year period. Um, we talked a little bit about solar. Wind is the other component. We've seen that installed wind capacity has grown exponentially. I will say the wind has not enjoyed the same type of decrease in price that solar has. Wind is still relatively expensive, not in terms of the operating cost, but in terms of the initial cost for investment, especially when you're talking about offshore wind here on the coast of New England. And without those regulatory subsidies for offshore wind, you're not going to see the type of dramatic increase in capacity here in the Northeast. In places like Texas, where they have a lot more wind to operate off of, and they have a lot more land in which to put this, you've seen the largest type of growth. So all of that's great, but what does that mean for our area? As I understand, most of the folks in this organization are located here in the Northeast or in New England. Well, if we go through it, we haven't seen the same type of growth here in the Northeast as we have seen in the rest of the United States. Certainly there's been some, but mainly the growth has come in natural gas over the last decade. Solar has gone to barely noticeable, up to 3%, and a lot of that is behind the meter, meaning that is on rooftops and different structures throughout the Northeast, not necessarily being controlled by the utilities. We have seen wind growth as well, but again, it's pretty small. Hydro and nuclear are going to make up the rest. So renewables are making up on a daily basis somewhere 10 to 13%. So it's increased, but still pretty small, and I'm including hydro in that. I'll just stop right there if there's any immediate questions. Okay. Moving on. So that's the shift in ISO New England. Well, how does that compare against the state regulatory bodies? This chart slide from ISO New England actually puts together the different types of requirements that each state has laid out for what they want for their generation within that state. And obviously, most of the states are leaning towards going to renewables. Rhode Island has a pretty ambitious goal of 100%, especially when Rhode Island is on a per capita basis, the largest user of natural gas here in the Northeast. But Rhode Island has laid out 100%, and you can see the other states have pretty ambitious goals, and starting as early as 2025, really ramping up in 2030, with the exception of New Hampshire. So these are again, these are not immediate action plans. They haven't been specified how we're going to get there, but state regulations requiring the state to take all efforts to get to these generations goals for renewable energy. Well, one is regulatory and one is political, but what does ISO New England have to say about that? Meeting these goals as the grid stands now is going to be exceedingly challenging. As you can see on the left, there's a significant number of sites that have retired or are retiring. I think they cite since 2013, 7,000 megawatts. So just massive amounts. 7,000 megawatts is basically 10 new natural gas power plants. So 7,000 megawatts retiring, and they cite a number more at risk. So you have a declining amount of power generation, which is occurring here in the Northeast. Now you have new generation coming on in both solar and wind, as well as a natural gas plant. But if we fast forward and we go to what type of peak demand will there be on the grid, considering the goals for both transportation as well as generation switching to electric, it gets pretty darn daunting on ISO New England being able to meet these goals without massive amounts of investments from both an infrastructure and the distribution, as well as generation side. To say it in plainer English, it's going to take a pretty heavy lift and huge amounts of cost in order to get the distribution in place to be able to supply some of the political goals on the electric side. That doesn't mean there won't be substantial increases, but we'd have to see building like we haven't seen before in transmission lines and upgrading of the grid to get here. So how about more on the state level? Because really, I think this is where it's going to impact everyone's business. Every state in the Northeast, again, with the exception of New Hampshire, has a fairly aggressive program in place. Some states are further ahead than others, like New York State, for example. But Massachusetts, they have a clean heat program, which they're going to supposedly rolling out the regulations at the end of this month. Um, it's basically a carbon tax, which will increase the cost, but it shows that folks who are looking not just only at the transportation sector, but at the heat sector as well for spaces to reduce emissions. And I do think Massachusetts will probably have some success with this program in emissions reductions. It's unclear what that cost is going to look like at this point because the regs have not been released, but that's definitely a work in progress. Vermont, for example, already has a program out. However, they are modifying it. At the last minute, they've had some major changes to the plan, so they're in the midst of modifying it now, and I expect we'll see something by 2026. The rest of the states are all in a little bit of flux, but they all have proposals that more or less mirror what New York and Massachusetts is doing. Included in that is something called the low carbon fuel standard for anyone in the transport business. This will have a major impact. This is modeled after a California program, which has basically a tax. I'll have a slide which demonstrates it a little bit better, but it's a tax on all transportation fuels. And if you provide a fuel which has a lower carbon footprint, then you do not have to pay that tax. I do anticipate something like this coming into the Northeast over the next 5 years. So sticking with New York for a second, here's some more color about what I was talking about. In 2019, they passed something called the CLCPA. Basically, they've got pretty ambitious goals on driving everything towards electrification. Coming out in 2025 or 2026, they want to put what's called a cap and invest. It's a carbon tax on all products which are sold in the state. But it's not just heating products now. It's going to be on transportation as well as possibly power generation products. Again, regs have not been released, but it shows you some of the difficulties in getting these regs accomplished. The law was passed in 2019, and here we are at the end of 2024, and we still do not have written regulations on what this looks like. There's also interest in a low carbon fuel standard in New York, and in the city of New York, there's something called Local Law 97, and Boston has something which is similar, which has not been implemented, which states that you basically buildings in that city have to reduce their emissions by X or face fines in it. And it's one way for renewable fuels to avoid these building owners paying fines if they reduce their carbon footprint. Next slide. This is on the area that I deal with a lot more than these other fuels, such as wind and solar, renewable fuels such as biodiesel and renewable diesel. And I put this slide up because it shows back in 2010, when Sprague first started getting involved in this in earnest, although we'd been involved a couple of years before that in Albany and the Bronx. 700 million gallons were the total amount of production of biodiesel, and there was no renewable diesel at that point. Fast forward to 2023, and we're seeing that number's up to 4 billion gallons. So a massive growth in a short period of time. And I anticipate these numbers to continue to climb because of the investments that we've seen, especially in the renewable diesel sector. Now, policy is unclear as we change administrations, but given that the amount of production and the amount of infrastructure that's been set up for this, this is by far the most effective way to reduce emissions within both the transportation and the heating sector that we currently have in place. As new technologies come in, that could change, but this is certainly one way that emissions have been reduced over the years in scale. So this is just a little bit about biodiesel. Now, one of the reasons why biodiesel's been popular over the years is the price, because of both tax credits and something called RINs. Typically, this product trades at a discount to heating oil, and you can kind of see it here. I don't know if you can see it that well on the slide, but 0 represents the cost of the NYMEX ULSD contract. So for the majority of 2024, the product has traded a sizable discount. which means that it gives incentive for more and more blending to occur both in the diesel and the heat streams. That has gone up now as we've seen a decrease in RIN value and really uncertain tax policy as we head into 2025, which we've talked a little bit about. Next slide. I was asked to touch a little bit on renewable diesel. I think biodiesel's been around long enough. Most people know what it is, but renewable diesel is now making its way into the East Coast of the United States. It's been around for a number of years, but if we go back to the production slide here, actually, I haven't gotten to that yet. Sorry, I'll jump to that in a second. It has grown exponentially in popularity. Yeah, we do have that slide out. There it was. You can see the growth is the orange in renewable diesel production. Primarily, that's occurred either via export or mainly in California, where they've had incentives in place to utilize renewable diesel. Now we're starting to see that make its way to the East Coast of the U.S. Renewable diesel, though, if the main takeaway is after you refine this product, it's identical to performance-wise to diesel. So there's no difference in the molecular structure of a refined diesel molecule from crude oil or a diesel molecule that comes from renewable products, feedstocks. The difference here is the feedstocks utilized to make renewable diesels have a far lower carbon footprint. So your carbon intensity and your emissions drop exponentially, greater than 50% versus using crude oil to make the diesel. But the end product is identical. And here's a slide which shows a little bit about that difference between renewable diesel and biodiesel. So mainly you're taking these feedstocks and one, you're doing a chemical reaction, which is biodiesel, which is still a very good product. You're left with a fatty acid methyl ester. And renewable diesel, you're taking these feedstocks, you're pre-treating them in a pretty complex system, but then you're putting it through the exact same refining process that you use to make diesel, in this case, a hydrotreater. And you're left with renewable diesel. So the advantages of that, obviously, if they're molecularly identical, you can deduce pretty quickly that it's an attractive fuel, because you do not have to change any of your infrastructure like you do with biodiesel. You don't have to heat the product. You don't have to store it separately. It can just replace diesel fuel as is. It's 100% drop in. Meanwhile, you're reducing your emissions by a substantial amount. Like I said, the quality and performance meets your diesel spec of D975 and is suitable for various applications. And what we mean there, you can use it in marine. You can use it in on-road transportation, which is where the majority of this occurs, or you can utilize for heat, which we've been experimenting here in the Northeast, and a few other companies have as well. And we've had nothing but good success because the fuel is identical to the fuel that you're utilizing for heating oil, just with a lower carbon emissions footprint. Now, here's the other factor of something that's going to be coming to the Northeast, and this ties into renewable diesels. When I mentioned the credit systems, like Cap and Invest in Massachusetts and in New York, all that credit systems is there's a benchmark. So the fuels that you sell have a certain carbon intensity. And each year the state sets a benchmark with a declining carbon intensity. You can see that on the right-hand side here. So if you have a fuel that generates a deficit, then you have to buy a credit. If you have a fuel that generates a credit, meaning it has a lower carbon intensity than the benchmark, then you generate a credit which you can sell. Now, obviously, diesel fuel and gasoline and kerosene, et cetera, all have just a carbon intensity. It is what it is. So over time, your fuel that you're utilizing starts to generate deficits, and you need to buy credits. So that's why fuels like renewable diesel and biodiesel, which have a lower carbon intensity, start to come into these markets, because those are fuels that generate credits. Solar would be another example. If you're using solar to generate electricity, then you can solar generate electricity, then you will generate a credit if that electricity is going into the transportation sector. So I can answer any questions on that, but that's what it looks like. And here's the results of those types of programs. So this is California renewable diesel growth, and this is why they're important. You can see the volumes over time for renewable diesel, which are in green, which were, nothing in 2011, now make up the largest component of the market in California for the low carbon fuel standard. And the amount of credits it generates are on the right-hand side, make up the majority of the largest, more than 50% of the credits. Now, these credits have value, and that's why folks want to generate them, because then they can take those credits and sell them in the marketplace. And because that incentive's in place, renewable fuels have grown exponentially in California. My estimate is that in the Northeast, you will see very similar types of programs. Now, I don't know what renewable diesel and biodiesel will play in this market because those rules have not been written yet. But renewable fuels will typically generate credits, and why folks are going to become more and more interested in. So I know that's a lot of data in a short period of time, but that is the end of my presentation. I can stop sharing now, and if there's any questions, I'd be happy to address them.
Kevin, can you hear me? It's Kristen.
Hey, Kristen.
Hi. So firstly, thank you. So much appreciate you doing this. Really proud of what Sprague is doing in this market. And you're obviously the expert in educating me, and thanks for educating this group. This group is comprised not only of wholesalers and accounts that we would know and be familiar with as our customers, but also, all kinds of different vendors across the energy industry. How can you, or what would you recommend? I understand that the credits and regulatory is really leading this charge, but how can we help support the movement to increase consumer demand, in your opinion, and that education among our companies, and ultimately to the consumer? How can we increase that?
Yeah, that's a great question, Kristen, and a hard one. I thought we agreed no hard questions. But I think the obviously getting in front of your customer and providing them with education on what's occurring in the market is always going to be important, whether that's in our business, the fuel business, natural gas, electricity, or any market. I would state that the best way is to also update the customer about the different regulations which are going on. Now, hopefully they're out there watching those for themselves, but alerting people of change that's coming and the potential costs that comes with those changes is really going to be the driver. We've seen a consumer demand will respond to pricing signals. So if suddenly the fuel they're utilizing has a high tax attached to it and there's alternatives which can lower their costs, they're going to be interested in that. If you can lower their costs and reduce their carbon footprint, that's probably going to go a long way, because a lot of your customers and a lot of our customers have their own ESG or carbon reduction goals. So you can provide products, but it's challenging without the regulatory framework in place. So I think that's going to have to come over the next couple of years. Are there any other questions?
We don't have any in the chat yet, but would anyone else like to ask a question without doing the chat and just come off mute?
Hearing none, Judy, I will turn it back over to you here.
Awesome. Well, thank you again to Kevin Grant from Sprague for coming on and presenting this webinar to us. Very, very grateful for the Sprague team. So what we'll do is this will be a recorded webinar, but if anyone has any questions that come to them this afternoon or over the week, please send them over to myself or Judy at Women in Energy, and we can get them over to Kevin and get you an answer. But again, thank you so much, Kevin, for presenting today and for preparing for this webinar. We know it takes time, and we really appreciate you stepping away from your day-to-day to present for our Wednesday webinars for Women in Energy.
My pleasure, and thanks for having me. I appreciate the opportunity.
Awesome. Well, if there's no further questions, thank you, and we will end the call. Have a great day.